Cause of death, undetermined, pending investigation. And we'll explain that as we go through the report this morning.
The family waited 18 days for this report. 18 days of funerals and press conferences and reward announcements and GPS data and a contradiction between two witness accounts that nobody has resolved. 18 days of watching investigators move slowly while a mother asked publicly, plainly, and repeatedly to simply be heard. 18 days of a case that kept generating headlines without generating answers. And then, on the morning of July 22, 2026, Attorney Ben Crump stood at a podium inside the 117th NAACP National Convention in Chicago, with Christine and Elmore Wansley seated beside him, and released the findings of the independent autopsy commissioned by Nolan Wells' family. The very first thing the pathologist noted, before any finding, before any classification, before any conclusion, was that something was missing. Not a small detail, not a footnote. A specific set of structures from the interior of Nolan's neck, his trachea, his laryngeal cartilage, his thyroid horn, his hyoid bone, had not arrived with his body when the independent examiner received it for review. They had been retained during the state's first autopsy, which is described as standard forensic practice. But their absence meant that an entire category of examination, an entire line of inquiry into what may or may not have happened to Nolan's neck before he entered the water, could not be completed at all. The independent autopsy's conclusion, cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. Not an accident confirmed, not foul play confirmed, not drowning, not trauma, undetermined. And sitting inside that single word, undetermined, is the most complicated, most consequential, most carefully chosen finding this case has produced. This is Crime Case. What we are covering tonight is not a dramatized account. It is not speculation. It is a direct examination of what the independent autopsy actually found, what it could not examine, what the pathologist said must still be answered, and what this report means, accurately and honestly, for everything that comes next in this investigation. Subscribe now if you are not already here, because this case is not finished. And what we cover in this episode is the foundation for everything that follows. Before we go into the findings themselves, let's go back to why this autopsy existed at all. On July 6, 2026, a park ranger found Nolan Wells' body in the water off the northwestern tip of Horn Island, 2 days after he had gone to the island with friends to celebrate Independence Day and not returned with them. Within hours of that discovery, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter offered the public an early explanation. An accident, he suggested. Nothing, he indicated, to suggest otherwise. The toxicology work had not been completed. The state autopsy had not been finalized, and still, a direction was offered before the science existed to support it. Christine Wansley said she had received little direct communication from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department after her son's body was found. What she received instead was an explanation that, to her and to Nolan's father Elmore, felt like a conclusion arriving before an investigation had genuinely begun. So the family made a decision that no grieving parent should have to make in the same week they are choosing a casket. They had Nolan's body flown from Mississippi to Washington, D.C., because they wanted to make sure they had a doctor who had no ties to Mississippi law enforcement to conduct an independent examination. The person they chose was Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., a board-certified forensic pathologist, former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, and president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest organization of black physicians in the United States. He had spent more than 2 decades examining deaths in some of the most contested forensic environments in the country. He had no connection to Mississippi, no relationship with any official involved in this case, and no stake in what his findings would ultimately show. Dr. Mitchell received Wells's body on July 10th, 6 days after Wells disappeared and 4 days after his body was found. He issued his preliminary report on July 19th. That report was released publicly on July 22nd in Chicago. What it found, and what it could not find, is the story of the next phase of this investigation. Here is exactly what the independent autopsy report says. Not a paraphrase, not a version softened for comfort or sharpened for drama. The documented findings, stated as they were stated. The most significant limitation identified in the report was the inability to directly observe the airway and lungs for water, and to directly observe the stomach for gastric contents. This matters enormously in any case where drowning is a possible cause of death, because the presence or absence of water in the airways and lungs is one of the primary ways a pathologist determines whether a person was alive or unconscious when they entered the water, and whether the water itself was the cause of death. That examination was not possible, not because of any failure on Dr. Mitchell's part, but because Nolan's organs, including his lungs, had already been removed and dissected during the state's first autopsy, as is standard practice. By the time they reached Dr. Mitchell, that particular window of inquiry had already closed. Internal structures from the front of Wells's neck, including portions of the trachea, laryngeal cartilage, thyroid horn, and hyoid bone, were not returned with his body. The report states that the Mississippi pathologist presumably retained those structures for further study, which Dr. Mitchell noted is a common forensic practice, particularly when there is concern about possible neck fractures or compression. The hyoid bone is the same structure that became a focal point in the Nancy Guthrie case, the small, horseshoe-shaped bone at the base of the throat that forensic pathologists examine, specifically because it fractures under sustained compression of the neck. Its absence here did not prove compression occurred, but its absence meant compression could not be ruled out either. Therefore, Dr. Mitchell wrote in his report, "This pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor or cause of death." That sentence is careful, it is precise, it is not an accusation. It is the honest professional acknowledgement that the evidence available at the time of examination was insufficient to answer the question. Decomposition created a third layer of limitation. The level of decomposition present when Dr. Mitchell received the body can obscure the presence or absence of bruising on the skin surface, especially during a second autopsy examination. Bruises that might have been visible immediately after death may no longer have been visible 3 to 4 days later. That absence does not mean no bruising occurred. It means the window to observe it, if it existed, had passed. What Dr. Mitchell could examine, he examined thoroughly. He performed additional dissections of Wells's face, scalp, neck, ribs, pelvis, back, and limbs. What those examinations showed, no apparent lacerations, fractures, or deep tissue injuries on Wells's body. And then, during the posterior head and neck dissection, the examination of the back of Nolan's skull and the tissue beneath, Dr. Mitchell found something he could not explain. During a posterior head and neck dissection, Dr. Mitchell found a 12 by 8 centimeter focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone, the back of the skull. He reported that the cause of this finding was unclear, noting that there were no lacerations of the overlying skin, nor fractures of the underlying skull. That finding is the one that has dominated coverage of the autopsy report since it was released, and it deserves to be understood precisely, not inflated and not dismissed. An outside forensic pathologist who reviewed the report, Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas, told CNN that the red discoloration could represent decomposition changes of the musculature, a natural consequence of a body that spent time in water and decomposed before examination, or it could be from blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck. Two possible explanations. One natural, one not. The report cannot distinguish between them with the information currently available. Dr. Mitchell did not call it evidence of harm. He did not call it evidence of an accident either. What he said was that it was significant enough to be noted, significant enough to require further investigation, and significant enough to be included as one of the 7 questions he listed before any cause or manner of death could be classified. This pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. Crump quoted from the report at the Chicago press conference. That sentence is not a finding of homicide. Crump himself said so directly. While Crump acknowledged the autopsy found no evidence of wrongdoing, he described the findings as inconclusive, undetermined, inconclusive, cannot rule out. These are not the same as confirmed. They are the honest language of a scientist working at the edge of what the available evidence can tell him, and being precise about where that edge is. Dr. Mitchell ended his preliminary report with 7 specific questions. 7 things that must be answered before any classification of cause or manner of death can be made with confidence. The 7 questions were: what were the circumstances that led to Nolan Xavier Wells entering the water? What was the position of his body when it was found? Was there evidence of water in his airway? Was there evidence of a brain bleed? Was he conscious or unconscious when he entered the water? Did he enter the water voluntarily or was he forced? And what did the toxicology reveal? 7 questions. Sitting in a preliminary report released 18 days after a 4th of July boat trip that should have ended differently. The most important of those 7, according to attorney Ben Crump, is the one that comes before any physical finding can be fully interpreted. The condition of Nolan Wells before he entered the water would be the crux of the matter, Crump said. It would be of utmost importance to being able to determine a cause and manner of death. That single question, what condition was Nolan in when he entered the water, is the one that every other finding circles back to. If he was conscious, fully aware, and capable of swimming when he entered, the picture looks one way. If he was not, if something had happened to him before he went into that water that compromised his ability to respond, to swim, to survive, the picture looks entirely different. Right now, nobody outside the investigation has that answer. Dr. Mitchell noted specifically that it is especially important to confirm how a person entered the water in cases involving someone who can swim, as was the case with Nolan Wells. Nolan had taken swimming lessons. He had been to Horn Island before. He was 18 years old and physically fit. The question of how he ended up in that water, in those specific circumstances, on that specific afternoon, is not resolved by this autopsy. It is precisely what this autopsy has now formally required investigators to answer. Now let's talk about the 3 gaps that remain after the report, because they are the reason this case cannot move toward any conclusion yet, and because understanding them is the difference between following this story accurately and following a distorted version of it. The first gap is the most significant. The state medical examiner's autopsy findings have not been publicly released. The state's report was completed earlier than the independent examination, and it is the closest forensic look at Nolan's body in time to whatever happened to him on July 4th. That report sits somewhere in a file that has not been opened to the public. No summary has been shared. No official statement about what was observed during those critical first hours after his body was found. That silence is not legally unusual. States often hold autopsy results pending toxicology, which takes weeks to process. But in the context of this case, where the family's trust in the local process has been strained since the very first press conference, the continued absence of the state's findings has deepened the frustration felt by everyone watching. Crump stated that his team is hopeful that Mississippi officials will share the observations and findings from the initial autopsy with Dr. Mitchell. That sharing has not yet been confirmed. Until it happens, the independent examiner is working with incomplete information, and so is the public. The second gap is toxicology. Dr. Mitchell did not order separate toxicology testing and had not received the state's toxicology results when he completed his preliminary opinion. Toxicology is frequently the determining factor in cases where cause of death is unclear. It can establish whether substances were present in Nolan's system at the time of death, substances that might affect consciousness, coordination, or ability to respond in the water. It can also rule out possibilities that speculation has placed in circulation without evidence. Without toxicology, the 7th of Dr. Mitchell's 7 outstanding questions remains entirely unanswered, and without that answer, the rest of the questions cannot be fully evaluated. The state medical examiner's office has completed its own autopsy but has not released results, and is waiting on a toxicology report to be completed. No public timeline has been given for when that report will be available. The third gap is the phone. This is not a new gap. It has existed since the night Christine tracked down her son's device using a monitoring application and found it with his friends, not with him. But it sits alongside the autopsy findings in a specific way now, because the 7 questions Dr. Mitchell listed, what led him to enter the water, whether he was conscious, whether he entered voluntarily, are precisely the questions that the phones present on that island that day might help answer. Crump confirmed that a joint inspection of Nolan's phone was agreed to during the DA meeting. As of this recording, that inspection has not been publicly confirmed as completed. His request that every phone present on the island that day be examined with equal scrutiny has also not been publicly confirmed as fulfilled. At the Chicago press conference, NAACP President Derek Johnson stood alongside the Wells family and addressed a pattern that he said the organization has witnessed across too many years and too many cases. Cases involving young black lives, he said, are too often allowed to close before they are properly opened. The narrative settled before all the facts have even been gathered, before every witness has been questioned, before every possibility has been genuinely explored. He did not say Nolan Wells was murdered. He did not say race was the cause of his death. What he said was that the speed with which certain conclusions arrive in certain cases and the resistance that families face when they ask for those conclusions to be slowed down and verified, that pattern is not accidental, and it is not new. Reverend Al Sharpton, speaking days earlier at the funeral, had made the same point from a pulpit in Mississippi, invoking the names Emmett Till and Medgar Evers from a church in Ocean Springs. Some of us remember what happened in Mississippi, he said. Before we can medicate and heal today, we've got to look at your history. Those names were not placed beside Nolan's carelessly. They were placed there deliberately, to locate this case inside a history that has never been fully closed, in a state where that history carries particular and specific weight. Wells was the only black member of the friend group that made the trip to Horn Island that day. He was the only one who did not return. That fact proves nothing about what happened to him. Responsible coverage of this case has said so consistently, but it also does not sit in a vacuum. It sits inside a case where an early conclusion arrived before the science existed to support it, where the family received little direct communication from the sheriff's department after their son's body was found, where key structures from the independent examiner's review were missing, and where the official findings still have not been released. The pattern is what Derek Johnson and Al Sharpton and Ben Crump are pointing to. Not a verdict, a pattern of how these cases tend to be handled, and a demand that this one be handled differently. Crump said that Dr. Mitchell should be included when a Mississippi grand jury hears results of the death investigation. That request is significant. Including the independent pathologist in the grand jury process would ensure that the 7 outstanding questions he identified are formally placed before the body that will ultimately determine whether any charges are warranted in this case. The $100,000 reward announced at Nolan's funeral remains active. $50,000 from Reverend Sharpton, matched by Tyler Perry. It is waiting for the person who decides that telling the truth about what happened on that island on July 4th is worth more than whatever is keeping them quiet. Somebody saw something, Sharpton said at the funeral. Somebody knows something. Let every stone be rolled back and every veil be torn asunder, and let truth pop out of the ground like a flower. Here is where this case stands as of July 23, 2026. The independent autopsy has classified Nolan Wells' cause and manner of death as undetermined, pending further investigation. The pathologist identified a focal area of red discoloration at the back of the skull with an unclear cause. He identified 7 questions that must be answered before any classification can be finalized. He could not examine the lungs, airways, or stomach because the organs had been removed during the state's first autopsy. He could not examine the neck structures because they were retained by the Mississippi pathologist and not returned with the body. He could not determine whether bruising was present due to the level of decomposition. The independent autopsy did not include a toxicology report. The state's toxicology results have not been released. The state's autopsy findings have not been released. The joint phone inspection has not been publicly confirmed as completed. The contradiction between what Katie said Nolan told her and what his friends told investigators has not been resolved. The 4 GPS movements tracked after the boat left Horn Island without Nolan at 4:31 p.m. on July 4th have not been publicly explained. Everything that was unknown before this autopsy was released remains unknown. What the autopsy added was not resolution. It added documentation, a formal, written, credentialed acknowledgement that the story offered within hours of Nolan's body being found was not and cannot yet be the complete story. For a mother who has been asking for that acknowledgement since the very first press conference, that documentation carries enormous weight. It does not answer the question she has been asking since the night her son did not come home. But it makes it impossible for anyone to argue that the question has already been answered. The truth about what happened to Nolan Wells on July 4th, 2026, in the water off the northwestern tip of Horn Island, in the hours after his friends left on a boat he was not on, has not yet been determined. Not by the state, not by the independent pathologist, not by anyone with the authority and the evidence to say so with certainty. What has been determined is that it must be. If you know anything about what happened on Horn Island on July 4th, contact Attorney Ben Crump's office or the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. The reward is $100,000. It is unclaimed. It is waiting. If this episode gave you the most accurate picture of what this autopsy actually found and what it did not, subscribe to Crime Case and like this video. We will be back the moment the toxicology results are released, the moment the state autopsy findings become public, and the moment anything else in this investigation moves. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He hoped to have 3 daughters. He cooked his parents' dinner the night before he died. He always came home. Until the day he didn't. And somewhere between that day and this one, the truth is still waiting to be found.